in a fog-choked hollow near Devon's southern coast. Ashford Hall sits abandoned, its stone chapel, scorched black by a fire no one remembers starting. In 1891, 3 children from the estate vanished during Lent. What remained in the nursery was a hymn book stitched shut with infant hair, soaked in curdled milk and dried blood. The church declared it unsuitable for parish record. The family's journals were sealed by the Crown until 2130, but I've obtained copies unredacted and untouched. This was no tragedy. It was a tradition.com in your country. If you're ready to see what the Ashford bloodline did in God's name. The fog hung low over the ruins of Devon's coastal highlands, not drifting but pressing like damp wool over the breath. From the crumbled edge of a manor long surrendered to the wind, the sea groaned a dirge, rhythmic as breath in sleep, or the pause before a scream. Stone bones of chimneys jutted from bramble-choked walls. Windows were eyeless. Nothing lived here, save the salt moss and the things that remembered. Elias Becker adjusted his gloves at the iron gate, its rust flaking like dried blood onto his coat. He was not a young man, nor especially old, but there was a particular stillness to him, like someone who had walked through grief so slowly, he no longer startled at its sound. His satchel knocked gently against his hip. Within it, oils and cloths and fine brushes, restorers' tools, instruments of resurrection. He stepped through. Inside, the house was not empty, only quiet. A long hush weighted every beam. Rainwater had carved paths through the plaster like veins. The air smelled of rot and salt and something infantile like milk left too long in a church. Light filtered through broken panes, gathering not in corners but beneath the peeling nursery ceiling. Where Elias first saw the cradle, it sat beneath a scorched oil painting of St. Agnes, whose eyes had long melted into her cheeks. The cradle, a blackened shell of oak, held only soot and a single object, a small hymnal, its binding scorched, its spine warped and stitched with a strange thread the color of ash or old teeth. Elias reached for it. It did not resist, exactly, but something in him recoiled, he did not know from where. The weight of it was wrong. Not heavy. The cover, cracked with mildew and faded ink, bore no title. Yet a faint residue of sound clung to it, as though it remembered singing. He opened it slowly, pages curled and discolored like skin under flame. Each sheet was sealed at the edges with delicate strands of infant hair, grown brittle with age, curled like question marks. The ink had long since faded until, in a moment of instinct, Elias struck a match. The candle he lit was beeswax, not tallow, an archivist's trick for breathing light onto ink without warmth. As the flame swelled, so did the page. Lines emerged, faint but legible beneath the flicker, a notation in musical script, childlike and dissonant. A single verse written beneath an old Devonshire dialect. One lamb's doe cry, the wax doth melt, and mother sings from shade. His throat tightened. He read it again. The words did not frighten him, but the shape they made in his mind did. He gathered the hymnal and set up his station linen cloth, scalpel, flat weights within the old nursery. He did not question why he stayed there, though the manor had rooms less ruined. The cradle sat empty now, save for a single hair caught on its edge, swaying in some breathless draught. By afternoon, he had catalogued 27 pages. Each required candlelight to reveal itself, and each bore a verse more fragmented than the last. Milk stains bloomed in strange constellations, and occasionally a single letter appeared blistered into the page, not written, but burned. By dusk, the room grew colder, though no wind stirred. It was then that the priest arrived. Father Rennick, hunched and gaunt, his breath whistling in the chill, entered without sound. His cassock was water-spotted, the cuffs muddied. He did not greet Elias, but looked directly at the hymnal. "You opened it after dusk." Elias blinked. "There's no light outside. It's hardly evening. The hill knows no hour, only silence." The priest took a cautious step forward. "That book was locked with more than hair. It remembers what flesh forgets. You will close it now." Elias met his gaze. "It was commissioned by the diocese. It's part of the historical." "Not that part," Rennick interrupted. His voice broke on the word. "It's not our scripture. It's what was buried with it. They found the child curled beside it, its mouth full of wool. No baptism, no breath." The candle flame guttered. Something moved across the floor, a brief shimmer, like breath on glass. Elias turned sharply. Nothing, only the cradle, its shadow long now. stretched toward the walls like fingers. That night, Elias did not sleep. He remained in the nursery, the hymnal before him. Pages waited. He thought he heard a lullaby, warbled like a mother's hum underwater. It might have been the wind, or the book. He dipped his brush into a preservation oil and slid it gently along the inner seam. As he worked, a note formed on the page-long descending chord that, impossibly, vibrated beneath the candlelight. The hair between the pages lifted slightly, as though caught in a breath. He touched it. Something sharp bit into his finger. He recoiled, a droplet of blood slipping onto the page. Instantly, the ink darkened. Letters bled upward from the page's edge, forming a new line of verse. Ink and milk, blood and hymn. The cradle rocks on hollow limb. His breath caught. The cradle creaked. No one was there. Yet the cradle moved, back and forth, back and forth. Elias rose, slow as prayer. The candle's flame tilted, then flared. The shadows in the corners stretched. He stared into the cradle, heart stammering. In his chest, inside, resting on the soot, was something new. A milk tooth. Small, white, unmistakable. Elias backed away. Behind him, the pages of the hymnal turned without wind. The baby hair curled inward, knotting itself in loops and runes. The notation lines shimmered, their ink now pulsing with the rhythm of a living heart. And then silence. Not quiet, silence. Deep and animal, a hush that reached inside the bones and squeezed. He heard it then, not aloud, but in the shape of the room, in the pressure behind his eyes. She must not wake. He turned and fled, down the rotted stairs, through the atrium of shattered dolls and sea-warped pews, past the wall where child-height crosses had once been hung. The front door opened before he touched it. The wind howled behind him, but he did not look back. He did not sleep for 3 nights. On the 4th, he tried to burn the hymnal. It would not catch. The flame bowed away, like it feared the thing. On the 5th night, he took it to the cliffs, where the villagers burned their whalebones. He buried it beneath salt and ash. But the next morning, it was waiting on his windowsill. The page opened to a new verse. If thou forget, the song remains, and in her breath, thy name. That evening, the villagers gathered outside his cottage with salt and strings of dried lilies. They did not speak. They left the items at his door, backs turned, eyes low. No one would meet his gaze. Inside, the candlelight began to flicker, and in the corner, just beneath the cradle of shadow cast by the curtains, sway, the sound of a lullaby began to hum. Soft, wet, close like breath through milk teeth. They said the bells stopped ringing the day. The orphans were moved, though no one saw them leave. Ashford Hall had stood longer than it ought. The stones softened by salt winds and time, its gables bowing inward like clasped hands. What once echoed with the lilt of prayer and children's breath now hung empty as a lung left too long in the cold. Brambles clung to its bones. The windows, once cross-latticed with lead, were now cataracted with grime, catching the light like old eyes. Eliza Whitcomb stood before it again after 30 years, her veil unfastened, her breath held not in fear, but in reverence. The key, worn smooth by decades of absence, turned without resistance. The doors opened as if they had been waiting. Inside, the rot had settled like dust on skin. Candles had long since surrendered. Their wax clung to the floor like frozen tears. The chapel pews remained, though buckled. A child's woolen glove rested on the 3rd row. Fingers curled toward the altar. She did not touch it. Eliza moved through the hall with the slow certainty of someone returning to a bruise. Her black shoes left shallow prints in the ash that carpeted the corridors, drifted not from fire, but from the slow forgetting of a place unprayed in. The smell had changed, not sour, nor fetid. It smelled of soaked linen and chalk and old rope. She paused at the threshold of the nursery. Here, the silence thickened. The walls, painted once in blushing rose, had peeled into blisters, revealing hymnal staves, scrawled beneath musical notations the children had once copied by rote. She had made them write them again and again. Music is memory, the old deacon used to say, and memory is the soul's longest sin. She stepped inside. The beds were gone. Only the iron rods remained, upright like forgotten crosses. On the far wall, where once hung a bell rope for prayers, there was only a fray of twine, stained dark at the end. Beneath it, a stool lay overturned. Eliza set her bag on the windowsill. She took out the cloth she had brought, white linen, faintly perfumed with myrrh. She began to dust the window panes, though no one had told her to. Her hands moved not with duty, but as if cleansing something sacred and long desecrated. Behind her, the boards creaked. She turned. No one. Still, beneath the warped slats of the nursery floor, she heard it soft, measured, deliberate. A step, then another. Pacing the same pattern. 3 steps. Pause. 3 again. She remembered it. Not the sound, but the rhythm. Sister Catriona had paced like that. On the night they took Jonah. On the night the bells did not stop ringing, but no one else heard them. Eliza stood very still. Not again, she whispered, but her voice did not echo. The nursery swallowed sound. She crossed to the far wall, where the bell had once hung. It had been carved with an angel's face, though time had blurred its features into something nearer sorrow. She reached into the alcove where the bell's mount once sat. Her hand found only dust and something colder, metal, thin, ring-shaped. She drew it out, a child's chain, twisted with tiny bells, mute now, their tongues removed. She felt them tremble against her palm. The floor moaned. This time. The steps came faster. She moved back, carefully, eyes on the slats. No floor should echo like that, not wood so rotten. It was too measured, too clean. She turned and walked back into the corridor, but not quickly. Rushing, she had learned, invites acknowledgement. In the main hall, the crucifix still hung above the entrance, though someone had covered the Christ figure with a linen shroud. Her breath caught. She had done that. It had been a game. Back then, the children had asked why the Lord bled. One child, Flora, had sobbed when she saw the wound at his side. So Eliza had covered it. He's sleeping, she'd said. He rests between prayers. The shroud had never been removed. She climbed the stairs now, each one protesting beneath her. Dust fell in threads from the balustrade. She kept her eyes low. To the west wing. Her old quarters. The door had warped with damp. She pressed her shoulder into it until it groaned open. The room was nearly untouched. A cracked picture, a faded copy of Revelations on the dresser. A photograph, faces long smudged, of the novices on Ascension Sunday, 1883. Hers was the only one turned away from the camera. She crossed to the dresser. The mirror above it had spidered with age. Her reflection came back in fragments, her mouth in one shard, her eyes in another. Nothing whole. Beneath the mirror, something waited. Folded cloth. She lifted it. Her old novice's veil, white-starched, still bearing the faint mark where the cross had once been stitched. She did not remember leaving it here. A bell rang. She froze, not loud, faint, a single ting, as if struck by a child's finger. Her mouth dried. Another ting. She turned slowly, staring back toward the hall. Her shadow stretched behind her in the candlelight. There had been no candlelight. She stepped toward the doorway. Down the hall the shadows danced. The sound of pacing resumed above, not below now. She felt her breath pull itself back into her chest. Jonah, she whispered. The name tasted like old communion, damp, metallic. The boy had disappeared after evening prayers. No note, no scream, just a silence that settled across the dormitory like gauze, and Sister Catriona pacing and Eliza holding the chain of little bells, saying nothing. She descended the stairs. At the base, the main door had shut itself. The crucifix swayed slightly in its frame. A child's footprint, faint but unmistakable, had appeared in the ash. The bells rang again, but now she knew where. She crossed the hall to the chapel. The altar was stripped bare, the cloth missing, but beneath it she could see now had been a hatch, a crawl space. The orphans were told never to open it. She knelt and pressed her hand to the wood. Warm, she lifted it. Darkness, stared back. She struck a match. Beneath a narrow tunnel, dust curled upward, and there, just beyond the flames, richer figure, small, barefoot, head bowed. She could not breathe. Eliza, it said, not loud, not angry, just said, a child's voice, but wrong in the mouth. Too many years behind it. She dropped the hatch. It thudded closed. Behind her the bells rang once more, then silence. Eliza rose slowly. She turned. The nursery door was open again. From within, something shifted like small fingers brushing dust from an old hymnal. She walked back, step by step. Inside, the cradle had returned, where the chain of bells now lay curled at its base. She approached. Her hand trembled. Inside the cradle was a folded scrap of paper. She opened it. The writing was hers. I heard him confess, but I said nothing. I feared the sound of bells more than the truth. The paper slipped from her fingers. She did not cry. Instead, she took the veil from her satchel and placed it gently over the cradle. Then, for the first time in 30 years, she knelt beside it. Outside, the wind stirred the ash in small spirals, and from beneath the floor, a lullaby began. Off-key. Incomplete, but remembered. The convent never shed its winter, even in midsummer, when the orchard bled with plums and the grass outside the vestry steamed in the heat. The halls of St. Lodora's remained cold like breath held too long behind cathedral stone. Light slipped through the tall windows, refracted through panes, stained not with saints, but with frost-shaped decay. Dust moved like incense, but slower, heavier. What prayers remained here were buried under mildew, not marble. The sisters were long gone now, their names engraved on headstones to clean for the history they held. But the corridors still bore footprints, narrow, dusty, and facing inward, always inward. Only one room still resisted rot, the nursery chapel, narrow, low-ceilinged, cloistered. Off the north transept its door nailed shut, not with timber, but with a length of braided cloth and a single strand of hair, greying, curled at the base like a question never asked. The braid belonged to Sister Agnes, the last caretaker, the last confessor, the last voice not trained to vanish. No one spoke of what happened after 1889, but the basin still stood. It was carved from slate, stained white around the rim. The sisters claimed it was limestone, but if you traced the grooves with your fingertip, you'd find the patterns were not mineral. They were written, a wordless script, etched with fingernails or bone, or both. On the night Sister Agnes disappeared, the chapel's single bell rang once, just once. No one came when it did. Now only the archivist wandered these halls. Her name was Maribel, not a sister, not even baptized, just a tired woman with ink-stained fingers and a file of brittle pages that crumbled when touched. She didn't believe the stories, but disbelief did not comfort her. If anything, it felt like blasphemy, like stepping into a confession box and whispering you weren't sorry. She unwrapped the bundle carefully. 7 letters, all unsigned, but clearly Agnes' handtype, slanted script with flourishes only seen in old monastic schools. And one diary, half-torn, the pages stitched together with red thread. The writing grew less legible with each entry, as if the words resisted being written, or the hands resisted remembering. April 3rd, I saw them again, voices trained to silence, not mute, erased. They open their mouths, and nothing comes. Sister Heloise says they've been purified, but they don't blink when they're touched. They just wait. They always wait. Maribel's eyes flicked to the chapel door, still closed, still bound with hair. She continued reading. April 9th, they call it the milk rite. They say it is older than our order, a baptism in white silence. They say Sister Thecla received the vision, that the Virgin appeared with a full breast and an empty mouth, and told her, wash them in stillness, that they may hear only God. A sound above. Faint, like porcelain shifting in a basin. She stood slowly. The letters trembled in her hands. She wasn't cold, but something inside her recoiled, as though a part of her remembered the touch of water before she was born. She stepped toward the chapel. The braid was frayed now, not cotton wool. Someone or something had peeled it loose, one hair at a time, as though undoing a vow. She touched the door. It opened without a sound. The nursery chapel was smaller than she imagined. No altar, no pews, just a stone basin, center of the floor, lit by a single high window veiled in soot. The light that entered there was yellowed, as if aged before it touched the ground. Around the walls, hooks, some still held garments, tiny, child-sized cassocks, curled at the cuffs. Beneath each, a pair of sandals. And the bell. No rope, no clapper, just the shell of the thing, suspended by nails. It leaned slightly to one side, as if listening. The basin was full. Milk. Or what looked like milk white, unmoving, thick as breath. In winter, on its surface, something floated. Paper. She knelt, reached. It was a diary page, not torn, placed. She lifted it. Letters bled up through the page, as though written from beneath. April 28th, one child did not vanish. Her name was Sylvie. She screamed during the rite. They tried to hush her, but the milk would not settle. Sister Heloise said it meant her soul was stubborn. They took her below. I heard them praying, but the words came backward. I saw her again that night. Her eyes were full of cream. She did not blink. She did not breathe. but she smiled, and her teeth were gone. Maribel rose too fast. The basin rippled. Milk sloshed, but no one had touched it. The sandals on the hooks swayed gently behind her. The door closed, not slammed, closed, carefully, as though someone did not wish to wake. The room. She moved backward, breath catching. Then dash. The bell rang. Soft, hollow, a single tone. The milk, Quivered, and from beneath it, something rose, not quickly, not violently. Just surfaced. A face, childlike, blurred with liquid, eyes closed, skin unwrinkled, mouth slightly open, no sound, just the image of silence. Maribel did not scream. She could not. Her voice shrank inward. The page in her hand crumpled. Without her noticing, she turned, hand fumbling for the latch. It opened this time. Behind her, the milk stilled, but she knew it watched. She stumbled into the corridor. The diary pages clutched like relics. Outside, the frost had returned to the windows, though it was midsummer, and beneath her breath, she began to recite the only thing she remembered from her grandmother's prayers. Protect us from white silence, from the still warmed breath, from those who drowned in milk, and yet rise on. She didn't remember learning it, but her voice knew the shape. That night, she locked the chapel with wire, then hammer, then prayer, but the milk had already marked her in the mirror above her basin that evening. Her mouth didn't move when she tried to hum, only her eyes blinked, and behind her, in the reflection, the bell swayed. Though there was no wind reached the chapel anymore. Though the trees outside swayed like they mourned, something still dying. The air inside had gone sour with the years, still soaked in bird rot and candle grease. The old doors creaked inward with no resistance when Elias Becker arrived, as though the hinges had not waited but remembered. He stepped into the nave, alone, though it never felt that way. The church had been decommissioned sometime in the late 1800s. The parish records water-damaged and sealed in city archives with a warning label, affixed in a stranger's handwriting, "Do not disturb the font. Birds return when it is moved." He had laughed when he read it. He did not laugh now. The smell hit first iron and damp feathers, mingled with a sweet, sour smell like spoiled breast milk. Then the noise. The crows weren't cawing. They were whispering, shuffling in their black-feathered communion, claws scraping the broken pews, wings rustling like funeral veils being drawn shut. 20-7 of them, Elias counted. They perched on the eaves, on hymnals, swollen with mildew, on the broken altar rail. One sat atop the baptismal font itself, its head tilted slowly. Once, as if it recognized him, he approached with the careful gait of someone stepping into memory. The chapel's stained glass had grayed into abstraction. No saints remained, only outlines of forgotten warnings. Feathers lay everywhere, some curled, some plucked with force, some pressed into the crevices of the marble font, as if deliberately placed, each one black, glossy, and faintly wet, as though freshly molted despite the absence of rain or sky. The font had once held holy water. Now it was ringed in a black crust, hardened into the shape of what once lived. Elias reached into his satchel and withdrew the small chisel and brush he used for fine restoration. He knelt, ran the chisel's edge along the basin's inner curve. Resin, thick and glassy. He dipped his brush into the crack beneath the font's base, hoping to gather samples. The bristles stuck. He frowned, tapped the handle lightly. Something moved beneath the marble. Not water, not stone. He dropped the brush and reached for the base with gloved hands, clearing away the debris. Then he saw it. A tongue, dried, small, not rotten but ossified. Its color was wrong, not the raw pink of flesh, but gray-veined, like something half-remembered and too long buried. It was It lay there folded, half-bitten, with something that might once have been a tooth embedded in the meat. He staggered backward, breath caught in his throat. The crows did not move. Not a single one flew. Only the one atop the font leaned slightly forward, opened its beak not to caw, but to click. A soft, wet click like bone tapping porcelain. Elias stood. He wanted to step back, but his legs felt submerged, not with fear, with guilt. He had dreamed of this place before, not precisely, but the shape. A font, dry. A bell, silenced. Something taken from a mouth, and a child whose name he had once forgotten on purpose. He turned toward the back of the chapel. There, a door remained chained shut with rusted iron, the links polished in places where someone something had poured at them. At its center, A circular indentation had been carved into the wood, as though a small head had leaned there for too long. Number child should have stood that tall. He moved toward it, slowly. The floorboards creaked underfoot, not loudly, but like sighs rising from the bones of the chapel. A feather drifted down before him, landing on his open palm. It was warm. He brushed it away. At the base of the chained door was a pile of charred wax. Candles melted down to their last breath, forming a waxen jawline along the threshold. One of them held the shape of a kneeling figure fused into the floorboards, like a frozen prayer. Elias knelt and reached forward, brushing aside the wax, and saw faintly etched beneath a name Sybella. He closed his eyes, not to pray, to forget, because he had known a girl once by that name, and she had vanished after a christening. She had not screamed, but her mouth had opened, and opened, and opened, but no sound had come, and afterward, when he had asked the sisters what happened, they had only said, "She has entered silence. She is nearer to God now." He opened his eyes again. The font behind him had begun to hum, a soft resonance, as if something within remembered being filled, not with water but with voice. He turned back to it. The tongue was gone. The crows were facing him now. All of them, their black eyes not angry, but expectant. He stepped closer. His hand reached again for the basin's edge. There was something inside, not a tongue this time, a piece of cloth. He drew it out carefully. It was stiff with age, singed at the corners, a baptismal sash, for an infant, on the inner seam, embroidered in white thread that had turned yellow. Speak only in silence. His mouth went dry. Behind him, one of the pews snapped, not loudly, like something had shifted its weight, and then a sound, not from the birds, from beneath the chapel floor, a breath not in, not out, just held. Waiting. The font shivered. Elias dropped the cloth. His knees buckled, and he fell forward. His hand struck the marbleland. It sounded hollow. He knocked again. A second knock came from within, from under the font. Slowly, he leaned down, placed his ear to the marble rim. A sound like fingernails, tiny, childlike, scratching from beneath. Not wild, not frantic, just a rhythm. Tap, tap, pause, tap. The rhythm of learning to speak. The birds began to rustle now. The whispering returned, a hush in reverse, as if the air was being drawn into them rather than out. He turned to flee. But in the doorway, blocking the exit, stood a single crow. Its chest was torn slightly open, not wounded, but unfolded. Within it, not flesh, but lace, baptismal lace, crusted at the tips. It stepped aside, inviting. Elias did not move. He stood, slow, turned back once more, toward the font. There, where the tongue had been, lay something new, a mirror shard. Not old. Clean. And reflected in it, not him, but a child, mouth open. Screaming, but no sound came. Only the birds listened. In the west wing of the crumbling convent, where plaster curled like parchment and the floor moaned in the dark, Eliza Whitcomb wrote letters to the dead, not aloud, never aloud. She wrote them in the old sacristy, beneath a spider-veined window that filtered light through soot and frost. Her fingers, arthritic and veined like riverbeds, moved slowly across the brittle paper. The ink bled at the corners, as though recoiling from what it was made to confess. "Madeline," she began, always the same way. "Dearest Mads," a pause, a breath. "That weighed too much. They say. No one remembers what we did, but the walls do. And I think the font still watches. Outside, the convent had fallen to crows and moss. The gardens were bare but for thornstalks and an old swing set that creaked even when the wind was still. Bells had not rung in 3 decades, yet the air sometimes trembled, as if waiting for a toll that never came. Eliza had returned out of guilt, not purpose. She told no one, wore the veil again only because it felt like penance, but she no longer prayed. Her mouth, once trained for hymns, only shaped silence now. The sisters were long gone, all except her, and the children, of course, though none were ever buried, none named, none officially remembered. Only 3 were known to the villagers, and even that knowledge was handed down like a curse, not a story. 3 vanished, a girl with burned scars, a boy who wouldn't stop weeping, and Madeline. Eliza folded the letter, placed it atop a pile of others, each bound with a pale ribbon the color of bone. The room dimmed slightly. She turned slow, cautious, half expecting. A shadow that was no longer memory, None came, but the floor behind her creaked. She looked toward the hallway. Empty, still, and yet she could feel it again, that strange tightness in the chapel air, like cloth pulled too hard across a child's chest. It had started with the white fastings. She had been 22, still soft-spoken, still obedient, still afraid of being told she wasn't holy enough. Sister Agnes had explained it gently at first, as though offering a blessing. The flesh must dim to let in God's light. They called it purity. They called it necessary. They said the children would understand once the silence took root. They were fed only milk, only at dusk, and only by spoon. Some lasted days. Others whispered too often, and were placed in the room of vigil, a locked nursery with curtains pinned shut and hymnals nailed upside down on the wall. They said light must not enter the mouth, and Eliza, she had stood beside them, hands at her sides, throat tight. She helped hold the smaller ones still. She wiped the milk from their chins when it spilled. She never once said no. Only once did she cry when Madeline looked up at her, eyes sunken from fasting, and mouthed the word please. No sound came. They'd trained her well. That night, Eliza found her own reflection warped in the font's water already darkened to tar. She wanted to scream, but Sister Agnes placed a finger over her lips. Keep the silence. It keeps you clean. She never saw Madeline again. But some nights like this one, she heard the child's footsteps, not running, just pacing. Beneath the chapel floorboards, a rhythm like prayer beads struck too hard. Step, step, pause. Step, step, pause. Now, she lit the candle. Its flame leaned backward. Toward the hall, she rose, letter in hand, veil hanging unevenly over her left shoulder, like torn lace. The hallway to the old baptismal chapel remained the coldest in the building. Even in summer, her breath would fog here. Even in summer, the walls would weep. Halfway down, she paused. The mirror, it was cracked now, fractured down the middle. But she looked anyway, and for the briefest breath, she did not see herself. She saw Madeline. Thin, blank, eyed, mouth moving but saying nothing. Eliza lowered her gaze. Walked on. The chapel door had warped with time. She pressed against it with her shoulder until it gave inside. The font waited. Empty. No crows today, but feathers black and curled were tucked beneath the altar cloth. And there, at the base of the font, a smear, not dust, not soot. Ash, layered so thinly it shimmered like a child's breath, held too long. She knelt before the basin, laid the new letter atop the others already waiting there, sealed in twine and trembling silence. She whispered not words, not prayers, just sound, as though to prove she still could. The flame behind her dimmed. Then from beneath the font, a sigh, not air, not wind, but a breath, a memory. Eliza leaned forward, knuckles whitening on the rim, and there, inside the bowl, something flickered, not a reflection, not light, a shadow with teeth, and eyes that once looked up and mouthed, please. She closed her own not to pray, but to listen. The floor beneath her knees hummed faintly, like song remembered by someone who could no longer sing. And in that moment, she knew the children had not vanished. They had dimmed, faded behind veils no longer woven from cloth, but silence, and she had helped. She had been part of it. She had watched Madeline unravel, one meal, one fast, one silence at a time. Eliza reached into the font. There was nothing inside, but when she drew back, her hand, it was wet, milky, smelling of rot and cradle linen. She held it to her lips and whispered, finally, I'm sorry. The air shifted. The candle went out. She did not leave the chapel that night, and by morning, the letters were gone, all but one. The one still damp with ash. It bore no name, just a child's handprint, faint and sticky, across the bottom corner. Pressed in milk, it began, as these things always do, in silence, to still to be natural. Elias Becker stood hunched beneath the slanted beams of the nursery attic, breathing shallowly through a wool scarf damp with mildew. The floorboards beneath his boots moaned with each movement, but otherwise the world was hushed, not quiet, but hushed, like a church between verses. Even the air was expectant, hanging thick with ash that drifted in lazy spirals from the eaves above, as if snow had lost its warmth and memory. The light came only from a small oil lamp, its wick flickering in the draughts that whispered down the chimney chute. Shadows clung to the far corners like cloaked figures watching from the periphery, and there, just beyond the reach of the lamp's glow, stood a trunk sealed with black wax, its lock rusted into the shape of a mouth forced shut. Elias wiped his hands on a soot-stained cloth. His breath fogged the glass of his spectacles. He had been cataloguing remnants since early afternoon. Hymnals nibbled at the spine. Tiny shoes tied together with rosary string. A cracked music box, still heavy with dried milk. Each object bore the weight of something almost remembered. He had not spoken all day. It wasn't until dusk, when the last rays slanted through the broken window pane like golden bars, that he heard the first sound, a tone, barely more than the breath of a note. He froze, one hand halfway inside a rotted drawer of baptismal records. His ears strained. Silence again, but no. Beneath it, something laced the stillness. A melody, distant and childlike, sung without urgency or need. Wordless, slow, familiar in the way a recurring dream might be recalled. Dreaded Elias, straightened, heart quickening, and turned toward the source. The psalter on the table had begun to hum. He stepped closer, squinting at its soot-caked leather. Its pages fluttered without wind. A few flakes of ash drifted from the rafters above, settling like pale feathers across the open spread. And the song, if it could be called that, pressed closer to the edge of hearing. Not in the room but in the book. He bent low, face inches from the page. The notes were handwritten, barely legible, marked with tiny brown crescents along the margin, like fingernail ink. Between the lines, faint staves had been drawn in charcoal, and above them, notes, no lyrics, only a melody. He did not recognize it, but it recognized him. As he stared, the tune grew louder, not in volume, but in clarity. He could hear the lilt, now, a lullaby cadence, uneven in rhythm as though sung by a child swaying on bare feet. There was something off about it, too slow, too mournful, like a song meant not to soothe, but to keep someone still. He turned the page. More of the same. Scorched ink, dry milk rings, child-sized prints pressed into the corner. A sharp breath escaped him. On the third page, a name, faint but unmistakable. Madeline. Whitcombe. His hand trembled. He remembered that name on an old disappearance file, one of the vanished three. He'd read it only weeks ago. No remains found. No inquiry pursued. Only a note from the archives, unsuitable for official record. He turned back to the cover. A faint embossed stamp remained, nearly erased. Ashford Chapel Psalms for Infancy and Burial. The lullaby continued, rising just beneath the surface of sound. He pressed his fingers into his ears. Still there. The attic darkened as night took the eaves. The lamp flickered once, then steadied. More ash fell now. Like gentle snowfall, it clung to his coat, his eyelids, his tongue. When he looked up, the ceiling beams were weeping. Not water, something finer, more ancient. It fell in long white threads, strings of hair. He stepped back from the psalter. The melody stilled. He did not breathe, and then a voice, barely audible. "Are you listening now?" It was a child's voice, sexless, timeless. Elias staggered back, knees striking the open drawer behind him. The lamp sputtered. He grabbed it, holding it high, casting the walls into dancing silhouettes. Something in the corner moved, not walked, rocked. A small chair he hadn't seen before nestled among broken doll heads and a splintered crucifix. A child's rocker, gently shifting, as if someone had only just risen from it. Elias backed away. The hymn book now shut, completely shut, but a sound pressed up from beneath the floorboards, soft at first, then rhythmically persistent. Clap, clap, paused, like a child's hands meeting in the dark. He crouched low, pressed an ear to the floor. From within, the beams too narrow for any body, he heard singing again. A different voice this time, thin, echoing. He knew it from a psychiatric archive he once reviewed. Buried under folio D23, untranslated melody, patient number 0176, Ashford Women's Infirmary, 1903. The same tune. He had dismissed it as coincidence, a folk remnant, a nothing. But now, here song beneath his feet. The ash fell heavier, and in its fall, he saw the room changing. The walls grew soft with breath. The hymnals on the shelf pulsed. The cradle once broken was whole again, rocking by unseen hand. He could feel it in his ribs now. That melody, like something old pressing against his bones, asking to be remembered, asking to be let out. Elias stood. The lullaby reached its final refrain, then cut. Not faded cut, as if the throat from which it came had been bitten clean through. He turned. The book was open again. A fresh line had appeared at the bottom of the page, in handwriting not his own. The white songs are for sleeping, the red songs are for staying. He did not move, not until he heard the floorboards behind him creak once, twice, pause, then, a single breath on the back of his neck. Warm, human. He turned, but no one stood there, only the window frosted now, and on the glass, a smear of milk-white fingerprints. 5, small, side by side. Child, sized, pressed inward, reaching, not out. In he stepped back, heart clawing at his throat. The psalter closed. The chair stopped rocking. The attic held its breath once more, and Elias Becker, for the first time since arriving at Ashford, could not remember the shape of his own voice, only the melody, still looping, still waiting. The chapel no longer took communion. Its pews sagged under dust and rat nests. Hymnals curled at the corners like leaves forgotten in frost. The stained glass window depicting the Visitation had long since fractured. Red slashes of Mary's robe bleeding across the floor each time the sun stooped low enough to peer through. Incense no longer hung in the air, only the dense, mineral rot of ancient mildew and extinguished candles. Elias moved through the aisle like a trespasser in his own thought. The floor creaked beneath him with the slow ache of memory. Each step forward felt swallowed by the silence. Even his breath seemed borrowed, too loud for the sacred hush clinging to the stones. The altar loomed, a head-worn marble grayed by time and soot, a spiderweb of hairline fractures spiraling out like veins beneath pale skin. The altar cloth was gone. It had been removed, folded, burned, perhaps. No record said so, but there was an absence that felt deliberate, and behind the altar, nestled within a recess carved into the back wall, where once the tabernacle lay, stood something that had not been touched in decades. A figure. Elias stopped 3 paces from it. It stood on a pedestal of oak, now warped with moisture, partially hidden in the half-shadow, cast by a broken votive lamp above. The child-shaped statue was no taller than a real 6-year-old, made entirely of wax-yellowed, cracked, translucent in places. Candlewicks protruded from the soles of its feet, burnt black and trailing down the pedestal like dried veins. Real hair crowned its scalp, in short, fine tufts, some clinging still too pale waxen skin, and teeth human rotted, brown-edged, uneven, locked inside a frozen scream. The face had been sculpted to show beatific innocence, or so the record once claimed. But now, it wore an expression of horror, not surprise, not pain. Pure horror. The mouth open mid-gasp, as though it had witnessed something unspeakable at the moment of its making. Elias stepped closer. His lantern flickered against the polished whites of its unmoving eyes, made of glass, clouded now, spiderwebbed with fractures behind the pupils. Pinned to the base was a note, curled and brittle. It cannot cry if it cannot breathe. He stared at the words. They were written in a neat hand. Someone had written that as explanation, as instruction. He looked again at the figure. The mouth had no opening, no breath hole, no escape. Just a frozen oval sealed with wax along the inner ridge, as if it had once been real and had since been silenced. The light shifted, and something behind the child caught his eye. A metal drawer embedded in the recess wall, so old it had fused in place. He dropped to his knees, tugged the iron ring. It gave with a shriek. Inside, scorched baptismal cloths, small paper tags, rosaries half melted into string, and near the back, folded beneath a cracked crucifix, a faded envelope sealed with red wax bearing the sigil of St. Agathon removed. Breast pierced. He broke the seal. Inside, a single sheet, a name, Clara, aged 5. Then, one line beneath, the wax must hold the soul. Elias stared at the figure again. The body was not sculpted. It was cast. Poured. There were ridges at the neck, tiny grooves at the wrists. This was not a statue. This had been a mold. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Something cold touched his chest. Not a hand, not breath, but knowledge, heavy, ancient knowledge. He turned to the floor. Scorch marks, in a circle around the pedestal. Melt lines. The child had been lit. Not once. Not CEREMONIALLY. Often. He stepped backward. The echo of his footfall, too sharp, too real. He looked up at the arch of the chapel ceiling, where faded murals once danced above the choir's reach. Now, the plaster peeled in strips like shed skin, revealing faint remnants, angels with no faces, halos cracked like broken saucers, children hovering in robes, mouths sewn shut with golden thread, and high above, a hook, a single iron hook bolted into stone. It turned slowly, though there was no draft. He looked again to the figure. The wick at its feet twitched, just once, as though responding, as though waking. He did not move again. The chapel around him grew still. Ash began to fall fine white and steady from the vaults. Above, it drifted over the pews, collecting in the grooves of forgotten Bibles, curling around the figure's hair like a crown. A sound stirred. Not a word, not a song, but a whimper. Long drawn dash out, wet. From behind the altar. Elias stepped to the side. The sound stopped. He walked around the pedestal, heart pressing painfully into his ribs. There, tucked in a hollow behind the oaken base, was a box, unlabeled, slightly ajar. He opened it. Inside, nails, dozens, rusted and bent, and below them, a wax mask, half melted, child-sized, its mouth a perfect oval, no eye holes, no string, only wax, and beneath that, a second note. Purity demands silence. Silence demands shape. He could not stay. His breath rasped now. Too loud, too alive. He turned to leave, and stopped. The child had moved, not far, barely an inch, but enough. Its head was tilted now, watching the lantern, trembled in his hand. The eyes no longer glassy. Wet, as if something within had risen to the surface. He backed away, and then, in the silence, a soft popping sound like a candle sputtering at the end of its life. A droplet of wax slid from the child's ear, then another, then blood. It dripped onto the pedestal, with a soft tap. 1, 2, 3, and Elias still, breathless, watched as the wicks at its feet flickered to life, not by his hand, but lit nonetheless. The flames hissed blue, then gold. The figure glowed from within, light tracing its hollows, its cracks, as if igniting something long buried, and, from within the wax child's unmoving chest, a sound like wind moved a breath, inward, first. Then nothing. Elias dropped the lantern. The glass shattered. The flames inside the child flared brighter, but the chapel remained cold, so cold as he fled. Down the aisle, the hymnals opened on their own. One page turned. Then another. No wind. Only breath, and the wax child watched him go. Still burning, still sealed, still silent, but behind it, the hook kept turning, and above, the murals began to peel faster. The angels' mouths began to open, one by one. They called her strange, but not aloud. Madeline, with her knobby wrists and lamb-white hair, too quiet even for a convent child. She walked like she was listening for something beneath the floor, her eyes pale as diluted soot, never quite focused on what was in front of her. She was not defiant, merely absent like a breath caught halfway to prayer. The other girls learned to avoid her, not from fear, from instinct. The nuns never mentioned the room. It had no designation in the ledgers, no key on the ring, no mention in the hymnal maps the children memorized for penance. But Madeline found it, or rather, it found her. She had followed a moth. That was all. It had been pale blue, its wings speckled like dust on stained linen, fluttering against the chapel's glass, where the Virgin once wept rubies. She followed it past the nave, past the bell ropes that hung like nooses in a priestless gallows, down the stone corridor where wall candles died in their sconces without sound. A door stood ajar. The wood was wrong. All other doors in St. Lucian's were pine, warped and grey and bowing from age. But this one was flat, seamless, painted the color of parchment dried in smoke. No handle, just a brass ring sunk into the grain. She stepped through. The air shifted. The scent was not quite must, not quite rot. A sweetness like spoiled milk. A flower-drowned. She was inside, and she was alone. There were no corners, not one. Every edge was bowed, every seam curved inward. The ceiling met the walls in a smooth arc. The floor rippled upward where a baseboard might have been. The geometry of the place bent softly, deliberately, like it had been shaped to be in doing so, became wrong. Nothing fit. The candle niches had no angles. The cracks in the tiles coiled like smoke, and the shadows refused to settle. She took a step. Her shoes made no sound. The room swallowed. Echo. She knelt near the far wall. If such a term meant anything. Heron drew a line in charcoal, just a line, vertical, measured by instinct. Then another, beside it, every day. She returned, always alone, never followed. She drew lines. They were not for days, though the sisters might have thought so, had they ever seen. They were not for penance, they were for her voice. Each line held a whisper, a secret, a sin. Hers. The room listened in the center. Where a rug might once have softened the stone, lay a depression, perfectly round, a hollow carved, perhaps, or worn by centuries of unseen knees. Madeline whispered to it. She leaned close enough that her lips brushed the stone. Her voice, almost song, almost breath. They put her here when she cried. Number 1 told her that no one needed to. She remembered. Not in the mind but in the marrow. But in the marrow, Eliza once pulled her from bed by the wrist. She was not cruel, only obeying. The ritual was white fasting. No sound, no food, no name for 3 days. Purity through forgetting. Madeline had remembered anyway. A girl before her Sarah, or maybe Loon had screamed, just once, in the night, and was gone by morning. Her name erased. Her cot given to another. No morning. Only the veiled bell rung. Once, at dusk. In the room, Madeline left her voice behind in fragments. Names, syllables, hums. She pressed her cheek to the floor and breathed in the cold like it was hers to carry. She began to draw figures, bent ones, children with no mouths. One day she found the charcoal already in her hand when she entered. She had not brought it that another day. She found a braid of hair tied around the niche where she kept her broken rosary. Not her hair, darker, shorter. Each gift came with silence, and the silence was full. Like breath held beneath water. One afternoon, the room was warm. That frightened her more than cold ever did. She sat in the hollow, knees drawn to her chest, arms around herself. The lines on the wall numbered more than 70. She whispered. She couldn't breathe when they closed the box. No one had said it, but she knew. The child before her had been boxed, wax poured in. The breath pressed out. Her hands trembled. She placed them over her mouth. Her eyes welled, not with grief, but with knowledge, a knowing that rotted from the inside out. She looked at the wall. One line had moved, bent itself, curved into the shape of a hook. Another had vanished, swallowed by the plaster. She reached out to trace one and gasped. It was wet. The line bled charcoal, smudged with something darker, thicker, that it clung to her fingertip. And when she wiped it on her dress, it smeared red. Not paint. Not chalk. Blood. She turned back to the hollow. It was deeper now, no longer a shallow dip. It gaped like a breath taken too wide, as though the floor had inhaled, and something whispered back. Not words, not sound. Air. She felt it. From below, a child's breath, sharp, panicked, then still, then again, a faint exhale, barely a thought. Her lips parted, and a lullaby rose. Not hers, not one taught in the hymnal. A melody with no beginning, a loop, like a child rocking themselves to sleep in a locked room, singing until the voice gave out. She joined it, a hum in her throat, thin, trembling. She rocked. The room did not echo, it absorbed. She sang with the breath below until the walls sighed, a sound like dozens of tiny bones shifting in damp linen. Then the door closed. She had not heard it open. She did not hear it latch, but it was shut. No handle on the inside, no keyhole, no corners, no escape. She stood. Slowly her legs did not want to move. The air was dense now, syruped with the scent of wax and old breath, and on the wall just above the place, she had drawn her first line. Another hand had drawn something new. A child curled, eyes open, no mouth, and beneath it, written in what looked like soot, "We still remember how to breathe." Madeline turned to the hollow one last time. She lowered herself into it, laid down her face toward the stone, and whispered. She cried once. They sealed her mouth, and beneath her, the floor exhaled. The candle burned low in Eliza's hand, its flame no larger than the eye of a sparrow. The corridor behind the nursery had once been a servant's passage, bricked over in 1891 and forgotten, until she'd followed the scent of damp plaster and the echo of something colder than breath. Her fingers brushed the uneven stone, and there beneath, a threadbare hymn pinned crookedly to the wall. She felt the seam, a vertical crack in the mortar, not unlike the scar on Sister Agnes's left wrist. The bricked-over door groaned as she pried it loose. No protest from the house, no wind, no draft. Just a long, breathless hush, as though the nursery above had pressed its palms to its ears. She descended slowly, each step swallowed by shadow. Her candlelight licked the walls, revealing paint turned brittle as frost-bitten skin and nails bent inward. Like questions, UNASKED. The staircase ended in silence. The infirmary lay beneath the floorboards like something too shameful for heaven or earth. No windows, no pews. The room was circular, lined with surgical cloths, yellowed and stiff like parchment prayers. Rusted bassinets, their wickers scorched, stood in a crooked ring. Beneath one, a trail of dried maroon led into the corner, where the tile was blistered black. The walls were still padded, but the velvet had frayed. Stitch marks the size of infant wrists climbed along the seams, crossing in patterns that looked almost devotional. Laudanum bottles and labelled, stoppered with wax crowded an altar that had no cross. Eliza stepped further in, her feet sticking softly to the floor. Here, silence had weight. It pooled in the creases of old linens and clung to the iron restraints fixed to the birthing chairs. No motion, no breath, and yet the room was not empty, not entirely. A bedroll lay folded in the far alcove, as if someone had returned, briefly, to remember the forgetting, and near the roll, a scrap of linen torn in two, one half blackened at the edge, the other still holding the embroidered letter, M. Madeline. Eliza's breath trembled, not from cold, but from something older, recognition, just she knelt beside a small porcelain sink, its basin etched with the old sigil of purification, a lamb within a flame. The faucet, long rusted shut, wept nothing, but beneath it, folded in the hollow of a cracked drawer, lay a set of notes bound in faded pink ribbon. She untied it. 4 pages, all written in a child's hand. No dates, no salutation, only scattered lines. I told them my stomach hurt. They smiled and said, "Good girls do not hunger." The ice made my jaw forget how to beg. Madeline tried to hide the tongue under her skirt. Sister wiped the floor and said to pray harder. Eliza's fingers curled tight. She had known about the treatments everyone had. She had heard the coughs rise through the vent like drowned birds. She had walked past the sister's room when the bells rang for silence, not for grace, and she had done nothing. No one had. Her candle guttered, light trembling on the wall like a fever dream. In the corner near the old hearth. She saw them. 3 chairs, smaller than a child's desk, each one bolted to the floor. Chains coiled through the legs like rosary beads worn, blackened links looped where wrists might go. Each seat bore a name carved with shaking hands. Thomas, Alice, Mira. The 4th chair was gone. Only the bolts remained, and something else beneath. The floorboards where the chair had once been a low, indistinct thumping, like water caught in the pipes. Or not water. Eliza leaned close. The boards smelled of ash and something sweeter, metallic. She pulled back, then caught her breath. A scorched tag jutted from between the planks, cloth, stiff with blood and heat. She reached for it. The whisper came first. So faint, it might have been memory. If it doesn't speak, it can't blaspheme. She froze. A draught stirred the infirmary, cold as cellar snow. Her candle guttered again, and then she heard it. Faint, lullaby, thin humming. From beneath the boards, a tune without language. A child's voice, perhaps, or what was left of it. The thumping stopped. She dropped the cloth. Her breath grew shallow. The air now carried a scent like burned milk, the same she'd smelled once, years ago, when Sister Martha poured boiling water down the drain after quieting the spirited. The humming had stopped a dot, only the ticking of a cracked wall clock now, a rhythm that didn't match time. And, in the silence between ticks, she saw the final truth. It wasn't spirits that had taken the children, not devils. It was discipline, doctrine, the sacred maid, surgical pain wrapped in purity. She rose, every step heavier now. The silence had weight. It stuck to her skin, crept beneath her ribs. As she turned to leave, she saw a tray near the door, stainless, cold as bone. Upon it lay 3 glass ampules and a pair of leather bite straps. The 4th ampule had shattered, the glass embedded in a bloodstain, long dried and ringed with salt. No names, no markers, only a folded note pinned to the wall above the tray. 4 words, in Sister Annis's script, no one left whole. Eliza said nothing. She blew out the candle. Darkness did not fall. It rose. The bells had been silent for 47 years. That was how Elias measured the hush in the chapel's stone marrow, by the absence of sound where something sacred had once rung. It was not memory he trusted now, but architecture, scorched beams, soot-lined windows, the cindered lip of the altar rail. These things held more honesty than recollection, which bent with time like leaded glass in heat. The fire began in the west wing, as all old fires do, and noticed. A whisper, in dry straw, a licked edge of curtain, a breath drawn too close to God. Elias had not slept in 2 nights. He had taken to pacing the nursery corridor with a candle and a tarnished bell, ringing softly at each hour to no one. The act made no sense, yet it felt required. Some things were not performed for people. By the time he smelled the smoke, it was too late. Not too late to run, but too late to unknow what was coming. The walls did not crack, they sighed. The floorboards whispered like bones grinding together. Somewhere beneath the choir loft, flames slid along the pipes of the organ, wheezing out fragments of hymns long since abandoned. And yet, above the growing heat, the bells began to ring. Elias turned toward the tower. It had always stood slightly bent, like it was listening to the earth rather than the sky. When the estate was alive, Sister Agnes had tended it, though few remembered her face. She was the one who lit the votives even after midnight, the one who insisted the veil must remain on, even in sleep, the one who kept the windows of the orphans' ward open through winter, to let the spirits escape cleanly. They buried her without a coffin. Some whispered, others said she simply vanished into the ash after the last child went missing. But now, above the flames curling through the rafters, Elias saw her silhouette. She stood motionless in the bell tower's highest window. Not a shadow, no. There was light in her, not holy, not warm, but flickering, feral light. Her veil dripped fire like a dying candle, each edge hissing as it met the night air. Her dress was not cloth, but smoke. Her hands glowed, and when she lifted one, the bell began its toll. No one had pulled the rope. The glass of the stained apse burst inward, not outward, as from heat, but as if drawn by grief. Tiny shards rained into the nave, spinning in the firelight like devout insects. Elias staggered as the ceiling bloomed red above him. Charred hymnals slumped from their pews, a cradle blackened to bone. And yet, the flame did not touch him. He walked forward, transborn, past the stations of the cross, past the locked reliquary that once held infant bones, toward the altar that now wept smoke. Across each doorway he passed. A line of char formed in his wake as, though Sister Agnes traced the lintel behind him. No footprints, but each threshold marked burnt hem at the edge of every prayer. When he reached the base of the tower, the door swung open before he touched it. The stairs inside were still cold, untouched by fire, but the air was thick with the scent of singed wool and something sweeter like sugar burnt too long. He climbed. Each step groaned beneath him. He thought of the children's feet, once too small to climb these, thought of the bell tower as they knew it, not as structure, but punishment. The last stop before silence. At the top, the room pulsed. With orange, the bells, massive and dust-caked, swung without chain or hand, their mouths opening and closing in slow rhythm like lungs. She stood beside them. Sister Agnes. Her face was not a face, but a veil stretched to thin, scorched through. In places, no eyes, only hollows, no lips, only a waxen grimace fixed in motionless hymn. She did not move toward him, only turned her head, and in that motion Elias remembered. He remembered the boy in the infirmary, the one who screamed even after the laudanum was poured down his throat. He remembered the sound of the leather straps pulling tight on the child's wrists. Sister Agnes whispering, God burns the rot to preserve the root, the way she held the match with 2 fingers, and the way Elias had not looked away. The bells rang louder. He fell to his knees. I didn't stop you, he whispered. I didn't stop you. Her veil flared, a crown of flame opening at the top of her head. The bells rang louder, as though they wept. The flames coiled through the bell chamber like serpents finding their nest. Below, the chapel roof gave way, and still, Elias could not look away. She stepped forward, not toward him, but through him. Her body passed like heat through cloth, like breath across a fevered brow. And in her wake, he saw the children, not full-bodied, not ghosts, just impressions, a soot handprint on a beam, a smudge shaped like a mouth beneath the bell ropes, a shoeless heel print in the ash beside the altar cross. They did not cry. They did not move. They watched. Elias turned back to the tower. It was empty now. The bells hung still. The flames vanished. He stood alone, but across every doorway, the burn marks remained. The fire had left no damage, no scorch on the walls, no smoke in the lungs, but each room, every hallway, every stairwell, every empty cot now bore the mark, a blackened line above the doorframe, as though something had passed through, pausing only to witness. Outside, morning crept in pale and trembling, but the chapel was no longer silent. The bells began to ring again, and this time it was not a warning, it was a summons. Elias waited until the last light faded from the nursery's high window, a stained arch where dust clung like the breath of something recently vanished. Shadows gathered early in that wing of the estate. It had always been colder there, as if the walls inhaled warmth and buried it somewhere deeper than stone. The old hymnals lay bound in fraying cloth behind the chapel's rotting pulpit, pressed between forgotten pew cushions and the crumbling bones of songbooks that had not been sung in years. He had not meant to open it. The hymnal was heavier than it should have been. When Elias lifted it, flakes of crimson leather came off in his palms. The clasp resisted, the spine groaned, but when it gave, it did so with a sound like cartilage snapping, and inside, beneath the ancient verses and bleached-out ink, were teeth, hundreds of them, small, rootless baby teeth, yellowed with age, some cracked, some glinting still, smooth as polished bone. They were embedded between the verses like punctuation, set into the crease of the book like ritual gems, nestled into grooves carved by hands with deliberate, blasphemous patience. Elias ran a finger along them without thinking. The cold leaped up his skin like a warning. Each tooth was paired with a name. The names were not written in ink. He did not need to touch the page to know it was blood. And then, the 3 blank leaves, torn, jagged at the edges, ripped out mid, the threadbare cloth at the spine, still marked by the weight of what had once been there. Beneath the imprint of the missing pages, faint indentations remained. 3 names, carved deep enough to echo through the paper even in absence. Madeline, Thomas, Clara. The candle flickered. Elias did not speak, though his lips parted. A sound threatened in his throat, but there was no word for this. He closed the hymnal. The teeth clicked as they shifted under pressure. That night, the bells did not ring, but something did. A low grinding, soft at first, like stone sharpening against stone. It came not from the halls, but from inside himself, from behind his own teeth. He woke the next morning with the taste of iron and chalk. In the basin beside his bed, 3 white fragments, tooth chips, smooth at first glance, but jagged at the root. His gums robbed. He told no one. Instead, he returned each night, as the house sighed in its sleep and shadows collected in the corners like forgotten prayers. Elias descended the stairs, again past the nursery door with its faded bell charm, past the portrait of the children that had been smudged long ago with soot, down to the pulpit, to the hymnal. It called him. And with each visit, the grinding worsened. By the 3rd night, he had wrapped cloth around his hands to keep from clawing at his own jaw in sleep. By the 4th, he had stuffed wax into his mouth, though the wax melted by morning. The tooth marks on his pillow bled through. The hymnal changed. Not see it at first, but the pattern of the teeth grew clearer. It was not random. It followed the shape of music, verses scored by enamel, harmonies etched in molars. The teeth sang, not aloud, but in memory, in absence, a silent choir of what had been taken, note by note. The missing pages haunted him most. He imagined their weight, their shape, the pressure of the names lost to ash. He dreamed of Clara's breath in the walls, of Thomas humming beneath the stairs, Madeline's shadow pressed like a smudge on the chapel's stained glass, her eyes always just behind his shoulder, never quite catching the light. One morning he found himself humming. He did not know the tune, but it came with the scent of laudanum and rot, and a strange memory of water poured into silence. That night, he did not go to the chapel. He burned the cloth he'd bitten through, scrubbed his teeth until they bled, lit every candle in his chamber, and tried not to sleep. But the hymnal waited behind his eyes. By the 7th night, the teeth had begun to move, not visibly, but their arrangement shifted. New verses, new names. He ran trembling hands across the page, and felt new grooves, recent, wet. He recognized his own name, not written in blood, etched in enamel. The final time he opened the hymnal, he did not flinch. He parted the spine as one might part a ribcage, slowly, with reverence and dread. Inside, he found not teeth but mouths openings where something once pure had been cawed out. A choir of absence. Silent prayers ground to ivory dust. The 3 missing pages had returned, folded, brittle and damp, with something darker than water. He opened the first dot. Inside was a scrap of hair, not pressed, not preserved, but torn. Madeline's curls, brittle, and still carrying the scent of lavender oil and sweat. The second page held a tiny shoe buckle, scorched black. The third, a drawing, childish, crude, a chapel, a pulpit, a hymnal drawn in thick charcoal lines. Above it, a face not smiling, mouth open, screaming, teeth missing. Elias closed the hymnal. He did not return to the chapel, but the bells began to ring again, not in the steeple, in his head, and when he smiled, a new tooth showed one knot, his own, small, crooked, as if borrowed from the past. It hummed softly when he closed his eyes. The tune was familiar now, and when he bit down, the sound it made was like the closing of a book. The parchment was brittle as dried skin, its edges scorched as though the sermon had once tried to flee the fire that now clung to its breath. Elias found it wrapped in the linen folds of Father Harrow's burial cassock, buried beneath the stone altar as if the valley itself had demanded the words remain hidden. The ink had bled, rain perhaps, or something older, but the handwriting was unmistakable, rigid, slanted, the ascenders high, like crosses hung too low. He read it aloud, though no one stood to listen. Whitewater Parish, Lent of 1891. To cleanse the valley of famine, one must first unclothe it of innocence. The ink thickened after that, as though dipped in something denser than pigment. Elias sat at the altar's base. The air around him tasted like damp cloth and burned milk. Above, a single beam of dust-filtered light passed through the cracked stained glass and fell across the floor in the shape of a chalice. Dust hung in it like ash, suspended mid-prayer. We misunderstood the hunger at first. The sermon continued. It was not for bread. It was not for crop. It was not even for blood. It was for nourishment untainted by guilt. We offered prayers. They curdled. We offered wine. It soured. We offered our own hands, and the famine deepened. The next lines had been underlined in what appeared to be wax. So the mothers brought their children, and the children brought their silence. And from that silence the milk flowed. Elias paused. His eyes scanned the sanctuary, where rows of pews leaned like weary ribs. The hymnals had long since molded. Where the choir loft once stood, only scaffolding remained stained with smoke. Splinters curled inward like fingers. A memory stirred behind his eyes. The milk rites. He'd heard the phrase only once before, whispered between 2 sisters with pale eyes and bitten nails. It had sounded metaphorical then, like everything else whispered in this place, like sin, like redemption. But the sermon did not read like metaphor. Communion, too, had to be redefined. If the flesh could not feed, then the body's memory must. If the blood spoke too loudly, then the milk must whisper. A tremor passed through the wooden beam above him. Elias looked up. The glass chalice on the floor fractured slightly, its edges haloed now in faint red, like wine but darker. He continued, reading. They were offered not in pain, but in quiet. No screaming, no bloodletting. The basin was cold. The cloths were clean, and they were light as if they had already begun ascending. A pause in the text, a blank line. Then, we do not speak of it now. We walk in light, but kneel in shadow. The valley is quiet. We have made it so. Elias turned the page. A diagram unfolded, a crude, hand-drawn outline of the church's floor plan. Beneath the altar, a room. Beneath the nursery, a tunnel. At the bottom of the page, scrawled in hasty charcoal, the words, "Communion was more than wine." He looked up again. Something had shifted. The chalice-shaped light had moved. Now it fell against the far wall, where a child's drawing had once been scrubbed away decades ago, but not completely. The faint trace of a stick figure remained, arms outstretched, something like a crown above its head, or horns, or antlers. Elias stood. His legs were trembling not from fear, but the weight of understanding. In the pews, shadows leaned where bodies had once sat. He could hear the echo of footsteps, small, barefoot, uncertain, moving just behind him. The air thinned. The parchment slipped from his hands and landed with the sound of a damp sigh. In the vestry, he found what he feared he might. The basin. Iron, wide enough for a child, stained beside it. Rows of linen cloths, folded, untouched by time, as though they had only just dried from last night's rites. On the wall above, a small wooden crucifix, but the Christ had no eyes. only hollow sockets, from which something had dripped once. The wood was stained there, streaked in long vertical trails. Elias did not touch it. He returned to the altar, reached beneath, found the loose stone, lifted it. A smell rose, sweet, rancid, coppery, like sugared blood. Inside, more parchment, dozens, sermons, records, names. Each with a date, each with a weight, each with a number. He did not read them all, but one he did. Clara 1891 pure, taken cleanly, no noise. Milk flowed freely. He dropped it. The candle above him flickered, and then without breeze extinguished. The chapel darkened, but something remained lit. The stained glass chalice. It glowed now, not from the sun, but from within, a pale light, milky. And just beneath it, across the wooden floorboards, a line began to spread, a thin wet trail, like spilled milk. But when Elias touched it, it steamed against his fingers. Not milk. Bone broth, thin, warm, full of marrow. He followed it with his eyes. It led to the nursery door, and across the threshold. It became footprints. Small, bare, wet. He did not follow. He could not, because in the silence that followed, something began to rise from the altar. Soft at first, a sound like humming, childlike, familiar. And then the bells rang, not from the steeple, from the earth, beneath the altar. A low, metallic tolling, a call not to worship, but to witness. The Whitewater sermon remained on the floor, where Elias had dropped it. The ink had spread again, bleeding slowly into the word cleanse, until it resembled something else entirely. The house had learned to be quiet again. That was the first thing Eliza noticed. It wasn't silence. Exactly not the natural hush of a place asleep or abandoned, but the unnatural kind. The kind that presses against the ribs and thickens at the base of the throat. A held breath, a prayer unsaid. She had returned to the nursery not out of courage, but fatigue. She had tried every other room, every hall, every locked drawer, but none had answered the thing gnawing behind her ears. None had given her back Madeline's voice, except here. The nursery's air still smelled faintly of milk, not sour, not yet, but on the edge of turning. The kind of smell that clung to lace and the lining of the lungs. Outside, the wind pushed against the eaves with a moan too long to be weather. The panes pulsed, then the humming began. At first it was only a shape in the ear, a suggestion, like a melody remembered wrong. Eliza turned, slowly, afraid to interrupt it, but it didn't stop. It came from the wall behind the rocking chair, the same chair where Madeline used to sit, fists balled in her apron, heels never quite reaching the floor. The chair was still now, though one spindle wept sap. As if remembering, Eliza stepped closer. The wall was unremarkable, lath and plaster, pale beneath years of paint. But the song was inside it. Hush now, bones in white, lie still, till milk turns night. Eliza pressed her palm to the wall. It was warm. She began to dig, at first with her fingers, then with the fireplace poker. The plaster cracked like old bread. Dust rose, thick and grey, coating her lips. She coughed and struck again. Underneath was not brick, not wood, but a door, no larger than a cupboard hatch, set low near the floor, edges smoothed by hands. The latch had no handle, just a loop of red ribbon, faded to rust. She pulled it open. The crawl space beyond was barely tall enough for a child. She had to lower herself onto her elbows, breath tight. The air was damp and sweet and wrong. Her knees slid along something, soft fabric, a doll, a nest. No, a shawl, child-sized, hand-stitched, inside. The space opened like a lung, just wide enough for 3 small beds, carved from pine and stained with what looked like oil, but wasn't. Each one was perfectly made, perfectly arranged. On the floor beside them, a porcelain cup, still warm. The milk inside had not yet skinned over. Eliza stared at it. The air around her shifted, not moved but remembered movement, like a breath drawn but never exhaled. And then, behind her against the narrow wooden wall, she felt pressure, not solid, not sudden, but sure, the faint weight of something leaning. She turned her head. There, along the walls, baseboards, were 3 impressions, like bodies had lain there, small, curled. One had a bow steel pinned at the nape of the neck. The second wore boots with buttons too fine for mud. The third had nothing at all, just a length of muslin wrapped like a burial shroud. Eliza tried to speak. No words came. her mouth filled with the taste of milk and dust. She looked back at the cup. It had been moved, closer to her. She had not touched it. The wall behind her gave a soft sigh. A release. She turned again. The entry was gone. Only the wall remained. The ribbon dangled limp from the sealed edge. Plaster stitched itself slowly over the seam. Like skin over a wound, she struck it. The poker made no sound, no dent. The beds had not moved, but now the shawl was gone, and in its place beneath the third bedder, small hand curled outward, not reaching, just resting, as if waiting to be held. Eliza backed away. She could no longer feel the air entering her lungs. The walls around her narrowed, breathless, not tight, but deliberate, intimate, as if the house had chosen her, as if this room had always been meant for four. Then she heard it again, Madeline's voice, but this time, not a song, just one word: drink. Eliza looked at the cup again. Steam rose gently. Her hands trembled. The milk smelled of cloves and something darker, something from the earth. She reached toward it, whether from fear or faith. She did not know. Her fingers closed around the handle. It was warm as flesh. From the wall something stirred. A breath, a footfall, the shift of weight on beds too, long unmade. Drink, the voice said again, closer now, not just in her ears, inside her skull. Eliza raised the cup, then paused. Her reflection stared back from the surface, eyes wide, mouth parted. Behind her, 3 others watched, one with teeth, too small, one with none at all, one whose eyes were sewn shut with white thread. She dropped the cup. It did not shatter, it simply spilled. The milk spread across the floor like spilled moonlight, soaking into the grain. The children did not move, but the crawl space grew smaller, not in shape, in time. Eliza felt her breath slowing. Her heart no longer thudded, but pulsed in long, slow rhythms, like church bells from underwater, or footsteps in snow. She leaned her head against the wall, closed her eyes, and from the plaster behind her came the faintest sound. The rocking chair, moving, not creaking, not groaning, but singing. Hush now, bones in white. Lie still, and then silence. Total, complete, as if the house had exhaled, and Eliza with it. The rain had not touched the bell tower in 6 years. It stood like a finger of scorched bone above the parish, blackened by lightning and age, yet somehow untouched by rot. The bells no longer rang safe for once. One night, when Eliza swore she heard them peal at the stroke of milk prayers, no one believed her. They said it was wind through cracked copper, or the birds who nested in the belfry, claws against the rusted rope. But Elias knew. He had seen the eyes behind the veil. He had heard the hymn repeat, not from a tongue, but from Woodlong, after Madeline was gone. On the night he chose to end it, Elias entered barefoot. The chapel below was still and cruelly clean, stripped of icons, but not of echoes. The pews groaned like something wounded as he passed. In his hand, a torch fashioned from linen dipped in altar oil. In the other, the last page of the Whitewater sermon, folded into his palm like a confession. The ink bled still. Despite the decades, his thumb left no print upon it. He did not look at the crucifix. There had been no God here since 1891. The ascent to the tower was slow, each step of the spiral staircase exhaling soot from beneath, the ash of psalms once sung and never forgiven. His breath grew shallow, and the air warmed not from exertion, but from memory. Something was awake above, something not born but built. When he reached the final landing, he paused. There, laid in the center of the bellroom, was the wax child. She had not melted. Her skin was poured from tallow and old milk, eyes painted on, but wrong just enough, wrong to feel watched. A rosary hung loosely from her neck, each bead shaped like a tooth. The same hymn that once lulled Madeline to sleep breathed through the boards, not sung, not chanted, but whispered by stone. Elias stepped forward. The torch dipped low, casting a long, dancing shadow across the far wall, and in the tremble of that shadow, the wax child blinked. He did not scream. Instead, he dropped the torch into the oil-stained straw surrounding her feet. Fire took its first breath, with a hiss, then a cough, then a moan. The flames climbed quickly, as though they had waited. They licked the beams, devoured the hymnals, nailed shut, consumed the velvet altar drapes like they had never belonged. The wax girl did not move, but the beads began to swing, each tooth clinking against the next like tiny bells. And then he heard Eliza. Her voice wove through the fire. calm and sweet, and far too close. She was singing the bedtime hymn. The one Sister Agnes had made them recite after the milk rite. The one Madeline hummed in her fever. Sleep, my lamb, the vat is full, the fire warm, the valley dull. Elias staggered backward, heart beating. Behind his teeth, he turned toward the stairwell and to find it gone. Not burned, gone. Where the opening had been was now wall, flat and unbroken, as though no one had ever built a way down. The tower shook. Chains, long nailed into the rafters, fell loose, clattering to the ground like broken prayers. The bells, for years, let out a low mourning toll. 1, then 2, then silence again. Smoke pressed inward. He could barely see the child anymore, though the flames never touched her. Elias dropped to his knees. The hymn did not stop. Drink your peace, the soil will hold. Your sister's hand, no longer cold. Ash drifted through a stained glass slit above, casting red and gold across his cheeks. It looked like blood drying on parchment. Something behind him breathed. He turned and saw her. Eliza stood at the far end of the room, but it was not Eliza. She was too tall, her hair too still. Her mouth moved in rhythm, but no breath left her. Lips and her hands folded gently over her apron dripped wax onto the floor in slow, steady tears. She stared at him with eyes he recognized from every mirror he'd covered. Elias tried to speak, tried to say her name, his mouth filled with salt and milk. The tower swayed again. A beam cracked. Sparks fled like bees from a broken hive. Still, Eliza sang, and still, the wax child blinked. He began to crawl toward the bells, hands blistering against the heat, desperate for a rope. Any rope, if he could ring them, if he could warn them, but the ropes were gone. Only the sound remained. The tolling, distant, but somehow inside him, like a heartbeat that wasn't his. 1, 2, 3. Then again, a laugh echoed through the rafters, childlike, hollow, ancient. The roof split. Flames poured inward, like revelation. Heat collapsed the stained glass mouth of a long-forgotten saint. The wax girl fell, not melted, but lifted by something unseen. Her limbs, stiff, as if mid-prayer, she hovered for a breath, then was gone, consumed, or carried, or both. The floor, beneath Elias, cracked. He clung to the edge of the altar, palms blackened, nails split. The hymn had stopped, but not the voice. Elijah, said Elizor, the thing wearing her voice. He looked up. She no longer stood, she hovered now. Veils singed to her brow, smoke threading her bones like scripture. From her chest hung the burned remains of the hymnal, pages stuck to her skin. They fluttered despite the fire, their verses unreadable, save for one, marked by a single burned hole. Do this in memory of me. And then the tower gave way. Elias did not fall, not in the way. By his fall, he folded. Like paper, like parchment made flesh, like a name etched in ash. The bells rang one final time, as the stone collapsed around the fire, and the valley exhaled what it had held for too long. At dawn, the townsfolk found the steeple gone, reduced to black bone and smoldering soot. One spoke, no one dared. The children stood in the grass barefoot, each holding a candle already burned to the wick. They did not cry. In the ruins, nothing remained but the clapper of the largest bell. Wrapped around it, still intact, was a rosary of teeth. They rang only when the wind touched them, just once, then silence. Then once more, when no one was listening. The velvet rope across the Ashford wing swayed once before stilling. No one touched it. There was no breeze. The windows had not opened in decades. After the fire in '91, Ashford Hall had been sealed, by law and salt and silence. The doors bricked in, the tower leveled. The soil refused grass for 40 years. And yet, when the museum took over, the first crate delivered to the archival basement was neither labeled nor signed. Inside, a sealed hymnal scorched at the corners, yet pristine in the marrow. It smelled faintly of chalk and milk. They placed it under glass in a redwood frame. Visitors paused, stared, and moved on. Children lingered too long. Pregnant women stepped away without knowing why. On the last day of October, Maren, the newest evening custodian, drew the blackout curtains. Early, the wind outside had teeth in it, and she did not like how the shadows looked on the glass. She made her rounds with her headset in, though the batteries had long died. Silence filled the wings like ash does lungs. At 11:57 p.m., she returned to the hymnal display. The room was still, lit only by one flickering bulb above the crossbeam. It threw light in a slow, circular pulse like a tired breath. The glass case bore condensation on the inside. She frowned. On the first night she worked, the other janitor, an older woman named Ruth, told her to skip this room if she could. Only one book in there, and it reads itself. Moran had laughed. Ruth hadn't. Tonight, the room was colder. Not draft cold, but deep cold. Old cellar cold. The kind that clung to your knees. The kind that hummed in your jaw. Inside the case, the hymnal was different. It lay open. She stopped walking. It was sealed. Ruth said it was sealed. A single ivory clasp, rusted but locked, held it shut when she'd passed earlier, and now it lay open at the center. Its pages spread wide, delicate, and perfectly still. There were words, handwritten, neat names, dozens of them, some smudged, some clear, first names only, in red ink that dried without shine. Madeline Thomas, Clara. She leaned in. The page turned. She did not blink, and still it turned. Not quickly, not theatrically, just one slow curl upward, then a whisper-soft fall as the next page revealed itself. She looked beneath the display, beneath the case, expecting chords or mechanisms. Nothing. The page bore new names. Some she recognized. From old archives, burial records, missing persons, those Ashford children no one wanted to Others were not familiar. Her own name wasn't there yet. Yet she exhaled sharply and reached for her phone. The screen did not light, nor did her flashlight. The switch flicked, but the bulb above gave a final slow flutter, then failed. Darkness. The hymnal glowed faintly, not with light, but with attention. It was noticed, even in shadow, and the scent came Vensera, but sweet. The smell of milk left out too long in sunless rooms. Not spoiled, exactly, but dense with memory. Moran turned, stepping toward the exit. A song started. Soft. At first she thought it was someone outside, perhaps a late straggler on a museum tour. But the museum closed hours ago. No footsteps, no locks, no keys turning indoors. Just a child's voice, pale and practiced, repeating the same melody. Sleep, my lamb, the vat is full. She froze. The words were wrong. She knew the tune, thought she did, but these verses weren't in any children's songbook. The cadence was too slow, the end of each line falling with a finality that made her stomach curl. She turned back toward the glass. There was movement behind the hymnal. It wasn't a figure, not yet, but a suggestion. Something leaned, something waited, and still the pages turned. Faster now. The edges of the paper whispered against the glass like fingernails tapping. The scent thickened. She backed into the doorframe. Her elbows struck the edge of the fire alarm, but no sound came. The world had dropped into something tighter, older, sealed. From the wall behind the case came a sound, gentle guttural, like a throat clearing, or a baby beginning to stir. Marin whispered no, but it heard her. The hymn shifted keys. A second voice joined, then a third. The notes weren't harmony, they were hunger, the kind of singing that exists not to be heard, but obeyed. She tried to run. Her feet did not move, not frozen, just delayed. Like walking through milk, thick and warm, despite the cold. She pressed a hand against the glass. The hymnal pulsed, beneath its spine, lifting, settling, lifting again. And the pages turned. Until they stopped. And there it was, her name, Marina Bell. Not written in ink, etched, carved, into the page like skin peeled back. She pulled her hand back, saw that her fingertip bore a cut not deep, but stinging. A line of red curled along her nail. It tasted sweet. The final voice joined the song. A child's giggle followed, and then a breath on her neck. She spun. Empty. Room no, not empty. The case no longer held the hymnal. It was gone. In its place, a teacup, white porcelain, half filled with warm milk. No dust, no cracks. A single hair floated on the surface, light brown, curled, childlike. She heard the footsteps now, not approaching, retreating, tiny bare feet across tile, padding gently, toward the west wing. And then, silence. Not peace, not rest, but silence. The next morning, when the museum opened, the security footage was blank, from 11:56 to 12:09, not glitched, erased. The camera logs showed no disruption. Marin was found seated on the floor of the Ashford wing, facing the empty case. She did not speak. Not for hours. When she finally rose, she left behind the mug. It was dry, no scent. but a fine white crust had formed at the bottom. They relocked the case. The hymnal reappeared 2 days later, closed, sealed once more. But the staff began to notice small things. Dust never settled on the glass. The room was always colder. And every Friday, after closing, a low sour scent crept down the corridor, like cream turned under moonlight, like teeth waiting behind lips. And the pages, they keep turning.